Hey guys, it's Miss Landry here, and I appreciate that you guys are watching these videos while I'm out on a trip with my 7th grade advisory. And I know that last time you guys watched the video, it was a little dark, so I got a ring light so you can see me now. So let's talk about some of the approaches. This is kind of a continuation of our talk on Wednesday. So learning targets, I want you to be able to describe the newest types of psychology and how it focuses on everything from cognition, which is thinking, to experience and culture and gender, and humanistic approach, which is flourishing as a human. I want you to also look at biopsychosocial approaches, and that's a big word, kind of crazy. And then I'm actually going to skip this one about how these psychological principles can help you on the AP exam, because we've kind of talked about that already with the learning styles. So that's going to be not on this discussion. So let's start with contemporary psychology. What is cognition to start with? Okay, so cognitive neuroscience is basically looking at the brain's activity and memory and thinking, and how do those two things go together? So, for example, like which neurons are triggered, what part of the brain lights up in an MRI, those kind of things. Cognitive psychology is basically the study of mental processes. So memories, thinking, perceiving, coding, like how do you take information in and then how do you retrieve it? Pretty important stuff. So what would you answer to this question? Go ahead and pause the video and answer that question in Edpuzzle. Okay, so hopefully you chose cognitive neuroscience. Obviously, that's what we're talking about. All right, so how does it focus on these things? Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is nature versus nurture. So we talked a little bit about this in class on Wednesday. Is it nature, which is genetics? So are you born with it? Is it innate? Or is it nurture, which is your environment and your experiences? We, in contemporary psychology, we actually believe both are just as important as each other. Okay, and it's not just genetics and experiences, it's actually how they interact together. So, two different people could have the same experience, but because of their genetics, they have very different responses to it, and vice versa. They, like twins, could have the same genetics, be in two different experiences, and have very different responses. So the interaction of those two is really important. So again, nature is all about genetics. Where's the mind? Is it inborn, or is it like it's innate, right? So you're born with these things. And then if you look at nurture, which is the experiences, you've got John Locke. If you remember, he was the tabula rasa, the blank slate. So we're born totally blank. And everything that we become is based on experiences, a result of experiences or the environment that we're brought up in. So make sure in your notes you write down like who is on which side of the field. So the guys over on this side are the nature, and on this side is the other two. And then a bunch of people are kind of in between. So I want you to do this on your notes. You don't have to do it on Edpuzzle, but think about your traits, okay? So think about height, hair color. You guys know hitchhiker thumb. Do you have a widow's peak? Are your earlobes attached? And then think about personality traits. So not just your stubbornness and your sense of humor, but how quick are you to anger? Are you anxious? Do you have a lot of anxiety? Do you have social anxiety? Which ones do you think are genetic? And which ones do you think are influenced by your environment? And I challenge you to see if you can figure out which ones are one or the other, or are they all a mix of the two? All right. So let's talk about Charles Darwin. He definitely argued, so he wrote that book on the origin of species. We talked a little bit about this on Wednesday, and his belief is that traits and behaviors are all there in order for us to survive or give us a reproductive advantage. Natural selection has a bit of it's a little bit misunderstood, because people think survival of the fittest, you have to be the strongest. And that's not actually true. It has more to do with making sure that you survive in order to reproduce. There has to be a benefit to more reproduction, because through that additional or more reproduction, you actually pass that gene on more often. So traits and behaviors that would help this would be things like anger, which we talked about, right? So survival. There's some studies about facial features and them showing more estrogen. So women with more estrogen have different features on their faces. They have thicker lips and smaller chins, and men find that attractive in terms of reproduction. So then mate choice becomes an issue. So Charles Darwin was definitely all about nature, not nurture. So he's the one that was looking at evolutionary psychology, although he wasn't really looking at psychology. He was just looking at natural selection. But we now have an area of psychology that looks at the importance of evolution and natural selection. We also have another subfield of psychology called behavior genetics. So behavior genetics looks at the influence and the limits of both the genetic, which is nature, and the environmental, nurture, and how they affect behavior and mental processes. So evolutionary psychology is all about everything being there because of natural selection. Behavior genetics looks at the role of environment as well as genetics. Twin studies are my favorite. Twin studies are really cool. So because humans are so variable, right? Like we all have different amounts of genetics and different codes of genetics. I mean, we have the same amount. So it's really hard to compare behavior in two different people because how much of that genetics is the reason why our responses are different. So we do something called a twin study, and we use identical twins for this. So monozygotic twins, and if you think about twins, okay, so you've got the egg and you got the sperm. I like the picture, right? And when it fertilizes, so I now have a zygote, when that zygote separates into two individuals, that is identical twins. So we call that monozygotic, meaning they came from a single zygote, versus dizygotic is two eggs being fertilized at the same time. So fraternal twins are actually no more closely related than any siblings. They just happen to be like cooked in the uterus at the same time. Okay, but twin studies have been really useful for us to look at how much environment plays a role since the genetics are the same. So we definitely use twin studies a lot. And when I get back from my trip, I will show you guys some really cool twin studies. We already went over this. Weird cultures, Western, industrialized, democratic, educated, and rich. I kind of went over that the wrong way. And remember that creates bias, okay? Studies are basically averages. And if we're taking the average of this type of person, it may not apply to someone who is not this person, which is most of the world, okay? So just be aware of that bias. I'm going to skip this one because I want to keep these videos short. We also, with contemporary psychology, we're starting to realize the importance of culture. And I have to tell you, I think that actually with COVID, we've learned a lot more about the importance of society and culture and how important it is for mental health. But you know, it's interesting, things about personal space, right? Like how close someone stands to you is very cultural. When someone starts to get close, you get like that fight or flight response. And we can test that in class if you want to. Beliefs about marriage and sex. What age should people get married? Should it be like I can't think of the word. Should the parents decide the spouse, or should the person who's getting married decide? What about emotional display, right? Like, is it okay to show emotions? Is it okay to cry? That's very cultural. And so I want you to kind of think about different cultures and think about how that affects how you behave. And we'll talk about this in a group chat when I get back. Here's an example. This is kind of cool. If you read a language from left to right, which is what we read, about 2/3 of the couples turn their heads to the right when kissing. So here you see the princess and prince of England kissing with their heads turned to the right. But if you read, most Hebrew and Arabic languages read right to left, which is the opposite way. They actually